In a time of rising unrest, when borders dominate headlines and immigration policy shapes the future of our nation, the truth matters. From the front lines of law enforcement, national security, and public policy, this is Frontline Facts, where rhetoric is stripped away, where politics takes a back seat, and where facts, hard, documented facts, lead the conversation. As instability grows beyond our southern border, as communities feel the impact at home, we bring you informed voices. Attorneys, senior law enforcement leaders, policy experts, and professionals who understand the law, the protocols, and the consequences. This isn't opinion. This isn't spin. This is clarity in a time of confusion. This is Frontline Facts, and the conversation starts now.
Welcome to Frontline Facts with Louisa Deason, where we correct the rhetoric on immigration issues and public policy. Today we bring you the terrorism expert. He's a former FBI supervisor in the Houston area, but he is also someone who has been very well known for knowing about the dangers in our communities. So with no further ado, Jim Conway, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Louisa. Thank you.
Well, and you and I have been friends a long, long time. But tell me a little bit about what is going on. I think that the word that everybody is afraid of is the Islamic radical and what is going on with that situation, almost as if we've learned nothing after 9/11.
Well, you know, Louisa, it's a very, very complicated landscape. I mean, I'm considered a counterterrorism expert because I worked the terrorism target in the FBI for about 10 or 15 years, and I was stationed overseas working in U.S. embassies. And since my retirement from the FBI, I've been involved with the State Department and with law enforcement agencies conducting counterterrorism training. So I've sort of seen the full gamut and the spectrum of change. And that change really, which we can talk a little bit about today, is what's really made it difficult for law enforcement and security services, because the landscape has changed so radically with cyberspace, with terrorism finance, with recruitment, and the basic breakup of different. It used to be very clear cut. There was Al-Qaeda, Sunni-backed terrorist organization. There was Shia-backed terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. But today, the landscape is so complicated with eco-terrorism and Mexican cartels and separatist states and jihadists and Christian groups and separatist groups. And it's gotten so complicated. And cyberspace has really, and we can delve into that a little bit, really brought about a paradigm shift completely, because back when I first started working terrorism, it was a lot easier because people had to go to terrorism camps. They had to buy airline tickets. They had to purchase weapons from arms dealers. Now it's all done in cyberspace. Recruitment, radicalization, terrorism finance, it's all done in cyberspace. And encryption has really changed things. Very simple things like WhatsApp and Signal have enabled terrorist groups. One of our former directors said they're all going dark on us. They use the term going dark because if you take just a simple example of the London bombing back a few years ago, where the jihadists came across the London Bridge and shot and killed numerous innocent citizens on the bridge, as well as a couple of police officers on the other side of the bridge. The British people said, how the hell did this happen? And it was very simple. Why didn't we know about it? Because these guys were using WhatsApp and they were communicating with end-to-end encryption. Simple as that.
Well, you bring up a very valid point, because
can't get out in front of that kind of stuff.
I met a guy at the Texas Public Policy Summit a couple of weeks ago from London, and he said the American people need to wake up. He was very clear in his message. He said, we're no longer living in the times of post 9/11 where the terrorists were still in their countries. We are living in, you've now allowed and are accommodating through, you don't want to hurt feelings and you don't want to be called and labeled a profiler or a racist. And we're allowing this to enter our country, and we have to stop right now. We have to stop in our tracks. And what is the defining moment where we realize we're in big trouble, Jim.
Well, we are, and the evolution continues. If we go back to 9/11, we knew that terrorism finance had to be dealt with. We knew that communications needed to be better assessed, collected, and analyzed. So we instituted the Patriot Act. A lot of people screamed about that, but it enabled law enforcement and intelligence services to in a more detailed manner, in a simpler manner, in an easier manner with respect to the courts and warrants, to capture telephone data of bad guys in international calls. But that's all changed because it's evolved from that. So we have to try to stay ahead of the game. If we look at recent, the big events like 9/11 have not happened. But what this radicalization and cyberspace has brought about what we have seen as these ad hoc attacks like we saw in New Orleans last New Year's. Okay, people are radicalized online, they're recruited, and they know how to overcome the system. The guy rents a truck that's an electric powered truck so he can drive down the sidewalk and people won't hear a diesel truck coming down. That's how we ran over 15 people. So it's a constant kind of cat and mouse game of trying to stay ahead of this. And it's really gotten complicated, Louisa. It's very, very complicated. And the terrorism spectrum includes everything from Christians to Muslims to secularists to people who are anarchists. It's the entire gamut. And now it's gotten complicated. We can spend a little time talking about that. Now the cartels are in the mix.
And that's where I was going next.
I have some reservations about whether or not the cartels really should be designated a terrorist organization. Because in my view,
100%.
By definition, are they really a terrorist organization? That's something we can talk about a little bit.
Well, and back to the fact that we both have a mutual friend, thanks for that introduction, but he speaks about, the Iranians that are radicalized, that are going through Mexico, and because they have a very large U.S. Iranian embassy in Mexico City, the problem is that they're being radicalized and trained in Chiapas before they come over. And so they're coming in, they're already here. So my biggest fear is people don't understand. When we had 9/11, the fear was that we were going to go there and fight terrorism, not bring it here. But it's here. Mm-hmm. My biggest fear is car bombings in the middle of the day, major shootings, things of that nature that are a really significant issue and a big concern to the American public.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about that. And we had literally a 4-year time period where they say 10 million, but I think it was closer to, there's about 20 to 30 million illegal aliens, in my view, running around the United States. And,
yes. And
many of them were brought in under the auspices of asylum, when 98% of them never would have qualified, because you know this from your immigration background, that there has to be a link to persecution and a reason why a person is given asylum. And we're a welcoming country. If somebody is the victim of persecution, whether it's religious or minority or whatever it may be, we're going to give them an opportunity to file for asylum. But when you have 10 million people come in and they're using a CBP app overseas and registering for asylum and being flown into the United States, that's
mind blowing.
It's beyond comprehension to me. But that's a national security issue. And when just going back, it's hard to believe 9/11 was 25 years ago this September. 25 years ago. I was stationed in Mexico and I had the counterterrorism portfolio at the FBI office there, in the legal attaché office. And at that time, we were really, really focused on that 1,500-mile border between Mexico and the United States, because we knew that 2 million people a day cross that border, legally and illegally. And much of it is in furtherance of commerce and so forth. But nonetheless, we really scrubbed and looked at who was crossing that border, and were they SIAs, what we called SIA, special interest aliens.
Special interest aliens.
Who were special interest aliens? They're people that come from a country where there is a predominance of terrorist activity. And that's not their fault, and maybe they're just innocent people going to work at their uncle's grocery store in Los Angeles. But the reality is they come from a country where there is a predominance of terrorist activity and terrorist organizations.
Well, and
so
Jim,
we
back to the
focused
point.
on them.
You're exactly right. The asylum cases, they were the most erroneous and the most unscrupulous types of asylum cases we've ever seen. 95% of those cases are being remitted now. And of course, you know the laws as well as you know the laws as well as I do. You're leaving a country for fear of political persecution or religious persecution, but it's to a neighboring country. It's never 7 or 8 states later or 7 or 8 countries later. So we saw a lot of this happening at the border with the dropping of the documents, legal permanent residence in Brazil and Portugal and other places around the world. But we didn't get, you're exactly right, those special interest aliens came from predominantly supported terrorist countries or terrorist countries themselves. And if you don't vet them accordingly, like we saw under the Biden administration, you have no idea who is here.
Yeah.
And so this is what ICE is tasked with, and everybody's getting hit with, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's not. We are on the verge of dying because we've let in a number of terrorists from different terrorist organizations. That's what I want you to explain to the public.
And you know the game, and maybe it's inappropriate for me to call it the game, Louisa. You know this because you were an immigration official for many years. But look, when you have 10 million people, 90% of which are filing under asylum, what's going to happen? They're given a court date, which is 10 years from now. The courts are backed up. Come on. Really?
Exactly. It's all by design.
Are we ever really going to adjudicate these cases? But, something else, if you don't mind, dovetails into this. And this is, this administration has been smeared with the Muslim ban. There's not a Muslim ban. It's very simply this. There's 56 Muslim majority countries in the world, and most of those people are welcome to come in and out of here. The ban applied to countries where we cannot vet the citizens coming into this country. Now, what do I mean by that? You might take a country like Sudan. It's in the middle of civil war, okay? If a Sudanese comes here, we have no way of vetting their name. We can't get a date of birth. Why? Because Sudan doesn't have a database. They don't have a system. The government may not even have any of this stuff in databases. So it was a logical thing to tap the brakes and say, wait a minute, people coming from certain countries, we cannot vet them. We cannot scrub them. We cannot determine if they're linked to a terrorist organization. So we're going to tap the brakes on this. Oh, that's a Muslim ban. It's not a Muslim ban. It's a ban of people that are coming here from countries that we have the right. Guess what? We have the right as a sovereign nation to scrub them and determine if they pose a threat to our national security or our public safety.
Well, and we saw that after
9/11.
9/11. We were accused of going out to certain neighborhoods and profiling. Well, to some degree, it's behavioral patterns that you follow, and it's certain patterns of certain things certain groups do. I mean, that's part of the intelligence that we gather from these groups.
Absolutely.
My biggest fear is that those that are probably here to do us harm are just a moments away from getting that signal where they all activate.
That's right. And, Louisa, you hit the nail on the head there. Profiling, that became a bad word all of a sudden. Profiling. Look, when I go to my doctor, he's a professional. He holds a medical degree. He's got 20 years of experience. I want him to profile me for heart disease. He's going to take all the variables, my blood pressure, my cholesterol count, whatever it may be, and he's going to profile me for heart disease. It's the same thing with intelligence professionals. Don't tell intelligence professionals how to look. They're not looking at just race. They're looking at a lot of variables. They're looking at neighborhoods. They're looking at activity. They're looking at communication patterns. They're looking at a lot of things. That's all part of the intelligence which people badmouth and say, oh, that's profiling. Of course.
Well, and ICE gets dinged every day over that. And it's like, we're not racially going out just for the brown people, as they say.
I know.
They're going after final orders of deportation that have taken place where people have absconded and ignored, and these are hardcore criminals. But if you happen to get caught, it doesn't matter whether you're from Mexico, from Iran, from any other country. If you're here illegally, you pose a threat to the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And guess what? If you're here legally, you're a criminal because you violated the law.
Yeah.
Look, my grandparents,
Section 1325.
were immigrants. We are a country of immigrants. We want people to come. We need people to come. But we have the right to determine who comes. Who comes?
Well, and let's take a little pivot here and go to
Okay.
how are people being recruited? You see U.S. citizens are recruited and they go to these countries and they're being radicalized and they're being trained in the camps and stuff like that. But explain how that process works. What apps are being used? What systems are being used? What are they teaching them that's calling these people? Because to you and I, it's common sense. It's like that's just lunacy.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to tell you how they're being recruited. Can you see what I'm holding up here?
Yeah.
It's called a cell phone. Okay? Everything is in cyberspace today. Okay? Let me give you a little bit of background. About 7 or 8 years ago, I developed a course for counterterrorism teams overseas, along with the State Department. Focused on the big threat, if you may recall, back about 10 years ago, between 2015 and 2018-19, the threat of ISIS was huge. Okay, the threat of ISIS was huge. Okay, we actually somewhat declared a war against the caliphate, the new caliphate, run by al-Baghdadi. All right, he brought in, Louisa, think about this. He brought in 160,000 foreign fighters from around the world. Now, how the hell did he do that? He did it in cyberspace, okay? He did it in cyberspace. We had the Arab Spring back in the early 2010, 11, 12, in that time frame. How were leaders ousted in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, throughout the Middle East? On cell phones. The Arab Spring happened on Twitter. Think about that. The Arab Spring happened on Twitter. I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I saw the crowds in Tahrir Square in central Cairo, and I said, there are literally tens of thousands of people. How did they all get there? On Twitter. It's the same phenomenon as I said at the onset. Terrorist organizations don't need to transport people to training camps and indoctrinate them. All that indoctrination takes place online today. The recruitment, first the radicalization, then the recruitment, the terrorism financing, and guess what? Al-Qaeda and these groups are using AI now. Hello. That's where we are today. They have very sophisticated operations, and they have people who are part and parcel of their organizations that exploit this type of stuff. So really,
it's every bit of a criminal organization, just like you do, and when you see, the smugglers and the traffickers, they've got it covered from A to Z. I mean, they've got it covered to those that recruit, those that transport, those that bring in and feed and house, everything.
Absolutely. And money's no object. Because all terrorist groups are involved in some type of criminal activity. And that was the window of exploitation for me in the FBI, was we always tried to identify their criminal activity. Why? Because they all need money. They all need funding. So they're always involved. Hezbollah, for example, is the biggest runs the biggest counterfeit operations in the world. In the tri-border area of South America, they pull between $50 and $100 million out of there every year, selling counterfeit software, counterfeit movies, counterfeit music, counterfeit Dooney and Burke purses.
And this is what people don't get, Jim. Let's go to that, because I know that it costs billions of dollars to the American public when there's counterfeiting, and people go, well, what's bad? What's wrong with a fake Gucci purse or a fake Louis Vuitton? This is what we target. They are using that money to fund terrorism.
Absolutely. Criminal and terrorist organizations. And there's a blending of terrorism and criminal organizations, and there's a synergy between them. Look, Hezbollah is linked to the Mexican cartels. They control, the Lebanese Hezbollah controls the movement of cocaine into Europe and the Middle East. And who are their partners? The source of it, the cartels. The cartels have presence. The Mexican cartels have presence in nearly 40 nations around the world.
Well, and I think they operate in like 66 different countries. But my problem is the cartels used to just smuggle in usually people and drugs. We used to always say, you know, the money and the guns go south, the drugs and the people come north. But my bigger concern is in the image of any general American citizen, they just think, well, these are just, you know, Guatemalans or they're Central Americans and Mexicans coming in looking for work. Wrong. That's not what we got under the Biden administration. So let's discuss exactly who we got. Now, I know that you guys have tracked this very carefully, but I mean, in a 10-year span working ICE, you know, we used to get maybe, say, 20 terrorists coming into the country. And during the Biden administration, we had over 274 come in that we know about. And you mentioned 160,000. I mean, people need to wake up.
No, you're absolutely right. I think one of the issues here that people have to realize is that the Mexican cartels, and we can talk about this a little more maybe after the break, about the designation of them as a terrorist organization. And I have some reservations about that a little bit, but it does open the doors for law enforcement and the intelligence community to better set their sights on the cartels and cartel activity in the United States. It really brings about a whole different aspect. But the cartels, if you go back to the genesis of the Mexican cartels, really, what was the genesis? The beginning really was, going back to the source of cocaine is Colombia. That's the source of the manufacture and the distribution. The actual physical source is the mountains of Peru and Ecuador, but it was the Colombians that developed the cocaine trade. And when the Medellin cartel with Escobar and Carlos Leda Rivas and all those guys were in charge, that happened in the late 80s up till the early 90s. When the Medellin cartel was taken down, the shift went from Medellin to Cali. The Cali cartel took over, and I actually worked that target for a number of years, and I was involved in some money laundering operations targeting cocaine trafficking in the United States. But the interesting thing is the Cali cartel looked over at Medellin and they said, where did they fail? What can we learn to become more effective and more efficient at this distribution of cocaine into the United States and the rest of the world? And they said, we're not going to go by air and by sea into South Florida anymore. That's over. We're going to go overland through Mexico and into the United States.
Exactly.
So they co-opted and they met with the Mexican drug trafficking groups, which were already up and running. They were basically involved in marijuana and some methamphetamine. And that was the genesis of what was the Gulf Cartel, Juan Garcia Abrego. You probably remember that.
Yes.
They formed an alliance between the Colombians and the Mexican cartels. And the Mexican cartels cut a hard deal at the front end because they said, we want you to be our UPS. We want you to deliver our cocaine into the United States. And the Mexicans said, okay, we'll do that, but we take 50%. And the Colombians stopped and said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? They said, look, that's it. If you can find another land route other than Mexico, you can let us know. They said, on top of that, we will guarantee you delivery. So if you give us 10 tons, we'll pay you up front the 50%. If DEA and Customs or the airport takes it off before it gets there, you still get your 50%. The Colombians bought in. That became the alliance between Mexico and Colombia. And because of that, the Mexican cartels made not millions, but billions of dollars. But what they did then is they diversified like any good business. Instead of being just the UPS, they now got into money laundering. They got into smuggling humans. They got into smuggling software. They got into smuggling music, DVDs, pharmaceuticals, everything. They
really don't care about the commodity or the product. They just care about making the money.
They are commodity brokers. And guess what? They tap into the oil fields now, and they steal crude oil, and smuggle it to black market refineries. So they have gotten into everything. But when you look at it, they've kind of followed the pattern of terrorist organizations, because Hezbollah is really the best at doing this around the world. And they have followed that pattern where they have diversified, and that's why they are so powerful. And they are not only systemic, but endemic in Mexican society, and they are part and parcel of every aspect of life in Mexico today.
Now, let me ask you this, because I attended the Texas Public Policy Summit a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that state legislators are trying to identify is how big the risk is and how these radicals that are terrorist organizations have entered this country, and what they are trying to hide behind is that religion of, the freedom of religion. And how do you fight that in investigating some of these imams that are here and some of the mosques? I understand there's over 500 mosques in the state of Texas. Not everybody's bad, as you say, but what's the risk that we're facing today as opposed to what it looked like 10 years ago, Jim?
Well, this is a quandary. This is a conundrum, and something we dealt with when I was in the FBI. Look, we honor the Constitution, and we know that our founders established the First Amendment was freedom of religion. Basically, because the Puritans came here, and the original Pilgrims that came here were being persecuted because of their religion. So freedom of religion is first and foremost in our minds as Americans, and as constitutionalists, we respect that. The danger is that bad guys can sometimes hide behind religion, okay? And this is the conundrum, or this is why, as my boss used to say, this is why we're challenged most, is because we have to determine what is legal and what is illegal. Prior to 9/11, the FBI took down a fundraising NGO for Hamas in Dallas, Texas.
In New York?
No, in Dallas, Texas. Actually, it was the Holy Land Foundation.
Okay.
And the FBI was admonished, this is a religious organization. Well, it's touting itself as a religious organization, but in fact, it was a fundraising operation for Hamas. Look, I was involved in a case where we took down the World Relief Foundation. It was a front for Al-Qaeda. It was run out of Chicago, okay? It was preying upon innocent Muslims who, under the rules of one of the pillars of Islam, is zakat, where you're supposed to tithe and give a portion of your earnings to your religion. And a lot of Christian groups do this too. But under zakat, people were... The World Relief Foundation had all these wonderful websites and advertisements about give money, you're helping widows and children, and you're helping support our clinics and hospitals for victims of the war and so forth, when in fact it was really a fundraising mechanism for Al-Qaeda. So it's up to investigators to separate the chaff from the wheat. What is real religion and what is criminal activity or terrorist funding? Look, Hezbollah has a military wing. It's a terrorist organization. It has a terrorist wing. But Hezbollah, the political party of Hezbollah, Louisa, holds 26 of the seats in the Lebanese parliament. So half the parliament are political Hezbollah members. It's a legitimate political party. Hezbollah in Lebanon runs hospitals, it runs clinics, it runs schools, and all kinds of social services. So there's a legitimate political party of Hezbollah, but there's a terrorist wing too. And the EU and us have really, really grappled over this. What is terrorism and what is legitimate? So that's the difficulty for law enforcement and intelligence services, is separating what is real and what is truly religious and what is a front as a religious organization.
Exactly. Well, it's no different than the NGOs used by, some of these border states that they, I don't know, Soros funded over 500 or 5,000, something of that sort. Mm-hmm. And all these NGOs were making money, and they were helping all these illegally criminal aliens coming in with giving them cell phones and doing all kinds of things. And of course, that's all at the taxpayers' expense. And that's what's horrifying, but we face a different threat today. So what I need to do is I need to go to a commercial break. We're going to jump right into, letting our sponsors kind of dictate what they're going to talk about for advertisement purposes. But I do want to come back to this conversation with you, Jim.
Thank you. It's great talking to you, Louisa.
When the stakes are high, clarity matters. In today's fast-moving media environment, misinformation spreads fast, especially around immigration policy, national security, and public safety. That's where Decent Consulting Services steps in. Led by Louisa Deason, former investigative journalist, DHS and ICE subject matter expert, and certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, Deason Consulting equips leaders, candidates, law enforcement, and executives with clear posture, confident delivery, and fact-based messaging. From immigration policy education and media response strategy to crisis communication and executive message development, Deason Consulting helps you cut through the rhetoric and speak with authority. Whether you're preparing for a press conference, navigating a complex policy issue, or facing high-pressure media scrutiny, we prepare you to lead. Deason Consulting Services. Strategic communication, informed leadership, measured response. Contact Deason Consulting today and be ready when it matters most. Call today 832-244-2488 or email louisa@deasonconsultingservices.com.
Do you have bad credit? Have you tried fixing it yourself and just get frustrated and feel like you will never be able to get to your goals? If credit scores determine what you buy and at what cost, then does it not make more sense to actually hire the big dogs to save you money long term? At Deason's Credit Restoration Services, they have a group of certified and licensed credit attorneys, also versed in consumer protection laws, who do all the work on your behalf to permanently eliminate those negative and derogatory items affecting your credit scores. As we say, there are two things we cannot help you cheat your way out of, and that is death and paying taxes. But restoring your credit will change your life. Please contact Deason's Credit Restoration Services by calling 832-244-2488. Don't wait. Rates are not going down, but your credit scores will go up.
So we now return to Frontline Facts. I'm your host, Louisa Deason, and we have a special guest today. He is a terrorism expert, and that's Jim Conway. Now, you wanted to talk about the cartels and the dangers that they pose because, in my opinion, there's that fine line between do we designate them as terrorist organizations or do we not? And what is your stance on that? Or what do you see with all of the years of experience you bring to the table, Jim?
Well, it's a complicated. It's a little bit of a complicated situation, but from my perspective, I first of all question, are the Mexican cartels really a terrorist organization? Now, let's start with the definition. What is terrorism? Terrorism is violence, okay? That could be bombings, kidnappings, shootings, whatever it may be. Violence against innocence, okay? Birthday parties, soccer stadiums, shopping malls, Christmas markets. So it's violence against innocence with an ideology behind it. There always has to be an ideology for it to be terrorism, at least by general definition around the world. And I've discussed this issue with security services in Asia and South Asia and Africa and South America. There has to be an ideology. That ideology can be political, it can be religious, it can be economic, it can be social, whatever it is. We have terrorist groups around the world that follow all those different things. My question is, what is the ideology of the Mexican cartels? There really isn't one. I mean, some people can say, well, it could be anarchy, it could be considered an insurgency. They're not really interested in taking over the government. Are they interested in influencing the government? That's a question I think that scholars and legal minds have to think about. But yes, they're terroristic in nature. They commit brutal acts of violence. They machine gun birthday parties of children. They machine gun weddings, funerals. They set off IEDs. They conduct beheadings. They are terroristic in nature. And they target innocents. But I have a hard time determining what is their ideology. Their ideology is the worship of money, is what they are, because they make billions of dollars a year. But on the other hand, now that they are designated by the current administration as a terrorist organization, that changes the ball game quite a bit, Louisa. Let's think about it. It's kind of like back in the old days in the 90s when Congress made street gangs designated them as a target for the FBI as organized crime groups. Suddenly you have a whole new set of laws that come into play, a whole new set of investigative techniques like Title III's, wiretaps, undercover operations. And guess what? All those techniques come into play, but when you catch them, guess what? They're not facing 5 years under state law. They're facing 20 years of federal time under CCE, continuing criminal enterprise. The RICO laws come into play. All of the federal organized crime laws fall down on them. And all these street gangs got banged, and a lot of them got put out of business in places like Newark, New Jersey. I remember this very well in my earlier days in the FBI. So what happens now? Let's go to the cartels. You bring in the set of counterterrorism laws, all right? You can bring in the Patriot Act. You can bring in things with respect to sanctioning, banking laws. You bring in the terrorism material support of terrorist activity. 2339 under the federal statute. Now you start hitting people with that. You hit a guy who owns an agricultural business, and you can prove that he's linked to supporting a cartel entity. It falls on him. Okay, he can be charged with and sentenced under material support of terrorist organizations. So it brings in a whole new set of laws. It brings in a whole new set of intelligence and law enforcement techniques. It does step on the toes a little bit. It's a little bit on the diplomacy side. The Mexicans don't like this because once you've designated a group that lives within and thrives within their country as a terrorist organization, that opens up the door for military operations maybe, and that makes Mexicans very nervous. And I have many good contacts both officially and unofficially in Mexico, and I understand that. Hey, the gringos just designated the cartels as a terrorist organization. Are they going to run a bunch of Navy SEALs down here, and are they going to begin military operations on our soil? So
we look at it like in my background, for example, they pose a significant threat they're in charge of child trafficking. It's not just the drug trafficking and all that stuff, but from a perspective of national security, aside from terrorism, the concern is that cartels, for the most part, are violent entities. We've determined that.
Yes.
My concern is we need to do something about those countries that continue to allow anybody to run through their country to enter the United States illegally. I mean, what we saw under the Biden administration was horrifying to me when we used to see busy months of apprehensions up to 800 a month. We were seeing 25,000 a month. That's unheard of. We've never seen that before.
You can't handle it.
You can't handle it. It collapses the system.
Exactly.
And we know why they came here. Most of them came here because, the deep state wants to change the rhetoric and the vote. And of course, local elections are incredibly important and people need to get out and start studying candidates. But my concern is beyond that, to the American public, to yours and my community, when they say, what is our biggest threat today? What is our biggest threat today? If we are not going to criminalize and call these cartels criminal, terrorist organizations, I mean, the threat is still very real. We still have fightings in the streets. Look at the O'Donnell decree case that happened with the indigents in Harris County. They're not even going through the jail system. They're being arrested and apprehended, but they're being charges are being dismissed. And so how many of those people are falling through the cracks that are terrorists that do pose a significant threat? I mean, the FBI assesses these statistics about crimes in different regions every year. What is your perspective on that?
Well, I always said border security is national security. First of all, I'd like to think that I'm a person who loves and respects the law. If we're not going to enforce the law and we're not going to respect our sovereignty, we're no longer a nation. And the impact, you hit upon it. The impact is far-reaching. It's not just illegal immigration. It's not just our ignoring immigration laws, which are on the books. They're on the books. If we're going to ignore that,
5 years.
Yeah, but look at the impact. It's not just it's not just immigration. It impacts everything. It impacts housing. It impacts our healthcare system. It impacts our education system. It impacts our social services. I mean, look at the impact on our nation's cities and towns. I mean, you just can't take in 20,000 new kids who don't speak English and come from relatively poor families and absorb them and have a viable education system. It's just, as you said earlier, it's just tilting the system. It's just tilting the system. And all of that, for me, is not just public safety, but it's national security. And
well, we all know what happened to the children. I mean, for years and years, having been worked even back to the INS days, you would do everything in your power to not separate that family unit. But we know most of the kids aren't coming in with that family unit. They're used as pawns to come in with other people that pose a threat. Look at the situations in McKinney. There's now allegations of Sharia law brochures and pamphlets being handed out in schools where people complain about, well, my God, the one thing that should be handed out is the Bible, right? I mean, you've got to be careful and cross that line, but I mean, where does it end?
Yeah. And these forces are, they're at play. They're at play. But again, I think it's a matter of, I think we as a nation have to stop and pause for a moment and say, are we a nation of laws or are we not a nation of laws? Are we going to respect the laws? If we're going to have open borders, we're going to throw all the laws out, we just have open borders, and we're no longer a sovereign nation. I mean, is this what our founders really envisioned for us? This is our 250-year birthday. Is this what they really envisioned? I mean, we have to stop and think about that. And I think there's some people in Washington today that are trying to right the ship, but a lot of damage has been done.
Well, we certainly don't want a situation in Houston as we see in New York. We don't need a mayor like theirs that makes empty promises, but has the potential in the background to being funded and coerced into. What we don't want is the socialism or the Islamic radical here. It's not productive. It doesn't go with Western civilization criteria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I understand what you're saying. Much of that is antithetical to our constitutional way of life and what we believe.
The people in Dallas, for example, that are afraid of all these Muslim men, they're, praying in the middle of the afternoon out in the streets in public in Texas. I mean, there's got to be some sort of wait, you can't do that. Or the burning of the U.S. flag and chanting "Death to America."
No, that's not appropriate. Certainly not.
Not appropriate. Well, so moving forward, what are the things that you see, not just from a legislative point of view, but at a national level, at the federal level? What laws need to be implemented, or what may have been in law that was changed that would maybe change the tide of who's coming in and hold people more accountable?
Well, I don't know if really a lot of change has to be made. Again, I'm not an immigration law expert, and certainly you know more about this than I do, Louisa, but I think we're a nation of laws, and we were founded upon that, and I think it's just a matter of respecting the law and enforcing the law. And if people meet the criteria for entry, great. We're happy to have them. As I said, my grandparents were immigrants, and your parents were immigrants, Louisa.
Well, and I was born and raised in Mexico City.
That's right.
Somebody calls me a racist, I go, wait a minute, I got here to the land of opportunity to make the best choices I could possibly make.
And don't we have the right to determine who comes